ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how. Well, hello there, my fellow FileMaker developers and learners. This is Matt Petrowsky bringing you yet another FileMaker tutorial video from my website, FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video tutorial, we're taking a look at the top 10 layout tips that I have. Things haven't changed a whole lot, but we've got a few that maybe you haven't seen or heard about. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about. All right, let's start with number 10. Number 10 is going to be making selections with the cursor. So here on my layout, as we can see, I have a number of objects, and the cursor, when it comes to making selections, has two modes, or I should say the selection marquee, as we call it. As I start to marquee right here, the great thing is I don't have anything in the background. So if I select outside and start my click right here, FileMaker has two modes for cursor selection. That is the pass over and the pass around. Now you change the cursor behavior by using a modifier key. You can see that right now what I'm going to do is hold down the command key on Macintosh. It would be the control key on Windows, and you can see that the cursor changes. As well, what changes is my potential selection. So I've converted the cursor from a pass over or a select what's under to a select what is around. Now currently I won't really grab anything in this position, but if I follow this line right here, the bottom line of this, and make sure that I'm below that line, when I marquee, I'm going to grab everything that is under, but if I now simply change that cursor, you can see that it's everything that is within, or everything that the cursor surrounds. Now what makes this really nice is that when you do have a layout object underneath, say there was a block of text or a colored block right here, and we'll send this to the background. Let's go ahead and quickly make that a nice little blue. Let's say that I want to make that selection. There's of these two objects. There's really only two ways that I could do that. I could hold down the command key, or the shift key, and make a continuous selection by continuing to select items if I want them, or I can marquee. Now if I click right here, I get the object that's in the background, and that's not what I want. So knowing that I can use my cursor mode and switch it from pass over to pass around, I simply just start outside of this edge right here, and I go down to the the layout area where I can't click on anything. I hold down my command key and I just pass it right up, and then I grab exactly what I'm looking for. So when it comes to cursor selections, make sure and practice those too, because it's really pretty cool to be able to grab what you want all in a line. You can also deselect. Always remember that. If I know that I'm going to pass over, and everything that this passes over, which is this tab panel, this button, this tab panel, and this background object, remember that you can always drop objects from your selection as well by using that shift key. So if I simply hold the shift key and say I want to drop this object, my selection now goes down just to the 3 objects in order to manipulate and work with those. So that is tip number 10. Tip number 9 is going to be use the object inspector. That is what we have right over here, where we've got these two areas, fields and objects. If you're not already familiar with it, you can find that under the view menu, and we go right to objects, and there we have objects tab. There's going to be a keyboard command that you can use in order to show that. I'd suggest that you remember that one. Some of us that have been working in FileMaker for some time, I have a ignore that coming up. I have a keyboard shortcut assigned to a different menu item such that it overrides my objects inspector right there with Command Option T. But that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that right there. We're going to go to the Objects tab, and we are going to use it in order to make selections. Now remember, the key thing that they added here is this little guy right there. If you have not been using this, this is a great way when you have a complex layout to filter down just to what you're looking for. So for example, if this layout was super complex and I wanted to find something, I of course can search. And the great thing about the search is the search applies to the name of the object by default, or the name of the object as you have named it. So you will have a mix of two different objects in this sidebar area in the Objects Inspector. You will have the names that you've given objects, but then the default object. So if I just type in tab, I'm going to get the tab controls, but that's only one way to filter out tab controls using the search. It's a quick way, but I can just go to all panel controls right here, which is going to include sliders and tabs. And then once I am on a given tab, let's see, I've got these fields that I want to grab right here. Currently, fields are not showing, so what I would do is if my layout was super complex and I knew I was wanting to make a selection, I would be able to go to the tab that I want right there by selecting to it. That's another key thing. What's great about this is you can switch tabs right there, but in order to get to a different tab, you can do it on the object palette itself. So if I select there, it'll switch to tab 2 for me. And what's nice is I'm able to make selections. I have to switch my filter now back to all. And with that selected, I'd be able to select those two edit boxes right there. So I'd be able to select that, and it's got my two fields selected. The reason that this is useful is there are many times when you're working in layout mode where things are exactly precise. Let's say that I've got this edge directly on the edge of this, and I really don't want to play around with accidentally messing it up. Two things I could do. I could lock this right here by going to the Arrange and then going to the Lock, and I've locked the field now, but I still need to be able to select it. But that filtering really helps out. I could put in my fields, and of course that will come up and it'll list all my fields. It's super simple right now. This is hard to show because this is not a complex layout. But if this was a super long listing, I would be able to filter out what I wanted by going to the tab panels and selecting those, and then that's not going to work, tab panel and filter. But if I select that tab panel, I've got it selected now. Now I move over to what I want. You can see that it switches and it maintains my selection. That's essentially what I'm trying to show you, is that if I select the area of the thing that I want, and then once I'm on that area over here, the selection has been made, I can change this in terms of filtering to see what I want to see. So a lot of users don't necessarily do that. They don't go, okay, I want to start in a panel and then switch to looking at text shapes. It's a quick little 2-menu switch. Otherwise, just use the search bar, and the objects palette is going to be super helpful in order to make selections. Added on to that, if I wanted to select all fields, of course, there's two ways to do that with this inspector. I can look at all fields here, and we'll go to just all of my fields, and I can now do a contiguous selection right there, which is select the first object, then the second, select first, then select the second. That's going to grab everything, but you can see that it also grabs this tab panel in this case. So what I would have to do is I would have to command click to unselect the panels themselves so that I only have the field selected. Or an alternative method is to use the select all. So with one of these types of objects, in this case a field selected, if we go up to the, I believe it's the edit, there it is, right there under the edit menu, we can see, and hopefully I'm not blocking this, the select all. Let's move over and get that right there. So I'm going to hold the option key, and notice that selecting one field, then holding down the option key, which may be Control or Shift, maybe Alt on Windows, will select all of the same objects. So essentially doing what I just did right there. But remember, you can always make as many selections of things that you want with the Command key, selecting just the fields that you want on the layout, and then be able to make your modifications, which is going to be coming up in an upcoming tip. That was tip number 9. For tip number 8, we are going to say use your, I forget what you even call them, adjustment tools. Let's go over to our Arrange and Align right here. And as I close these up and we take a look on screen, this is what we are interested in. This right here, the Arrange and Align, so immensely useful and valuable. In particular, the resizing and using a reference object. Now, my suggestion is you assign a keyboard shortcut command or learn them if you're on Windows. There's probably a keyboard equivalent. But let's take an example. Let's say I've got a field right here, and then I've got another field right down here. That made a duplicate, which we're okay with, and I'm going to size that right there. All right, so I've got 3 different fields. I'm doing a layout redesign, and I want these 2 fields to look like this field right here. Of course, the easy way is to simply select all 3 fields, holding down the Shift key, and then use the resize right here where we've got resize to smallest width, largest width, height, etc. Now here's the difficult part. you have to sit there and hover over these and sort of immediately understand what they mean. And really, to be honest, they're a little confusing. So right now what I want to do is I want to resize to the smallest height, right there, smallest, and then I want to put them all up on the top edges, which is this one right here. And then maybe I want to resize and get all these fields the exact same to the largest. Which one is the largest width? There we go, right there. All right, so that took a little bit of time right there. But assign keyboard shortcuts to these. So if I undo this, undo, and get everything back to how it was, watch how quickly I can do this with my keyboard shortcut keys. Boom, boom, and boom. It was that quick. It was 3 keys that I hit in order to do that. So all of these options have the ability to assign shortcut keys. Let me show you how to do that on the Macintosh. On Windows, they may already be assigned. So if we go up to the Arrange menu, and then we zoom in here to the Align, notice that these are my keyboard shortcuts. Left edges, centers, right edges, top edges, middle, and bottom. So I have taken the opportunity where on your copy of FileMaker, you do not have keyboard shortcuts assigned for all of these. You can use mine if you'd like. There's also the resize to, where you're going to see that I have keyboard shortcuts assigned to smallest height and width, and largest height and width. How do you do this on the Macintosh? Really easy. We're going to go to our Preferences panel, which I'm going to open up right now, and then we are going to go to the keyboard. On the keyboard, we are going to go to Shortcuts right here. Then we are going to go to App Shortcuts, and here you can see that I have added the application FileMaker Pro Advanced 18. And right here is this little plus sign. So you click to add that. And from here, you can see that there's a smallest height right there. All you really have to do is when you add a new menu, after adding a new application, is simply add the menu as it's shown in the menu bar. So if we go over to FileMaker and we say, look at the Arrange, well, we've got the Align, and there we've got the Resize. So there it is. Just type in smallest width into that control panel, assign the keyboard shortcut that you want, and it becomes infinitely easier in order to realign or readjust things, especially if you use a reference object. So let's say I have a button somewhere and I want to, or all of these fields, let's align all of these fields on top or above all of these. So this is really easy for me. I'm going to use my previous tip right now. I'm going to marquee and do a surround. I'm going to first resize everything to the same height. Then I'm going to select those and realign, select that and realign, that and realign, and then this one, and there we go. All field labels are now above. I can use my keyboard shortcut, which is one that you should know. I'm not going to put this as a tip. In FileMaker 18 and higher, you can hold down the Shift key and adjust that by 10 pixels, or just tap the arrow key and move it one at a time if you want to, until it all lines up on the top. Group it down, and you can see that those bulk actions really help out when you're working in layout mode. So that's tip number 8, is use those auto arrange and align, and most importantly, assign keyboard shortcuts. All right, for tip number 7, I am calling this Top Object Wins. And this is a great way to think about this particular technique. It deals with conditional formatting and when you have multiple layouts. So in my scenario right now, I have layout 2 and I have layout 3. We flip between them and they look pretty much the same. And a lot of the times we're doing that in our layout design. But when we look at layout 1, we've got an object that has conditional formatting. And we go into our conditional formatting by right-clicking and we look at it. We've got 2 different rules. Now maybe you have, let's say, 5 different rules or 6 different rules, and you want to get all of those same rules onto another object. Well, never fear, you do not have to go through and manually do this by selecting this object, choosing conditional formatting, and then going and clicking add and adding a new one. This is a wonderful tip. In fact, I know a lot of advanced FileMaker developers that don't even really know about this. The way that this works is as I select this object and this object, make note of what we're seeing here in the palette, and that is because the top object wins. And by that, I mean that if I select this object and this object, and I can see that when I select this object, it is the bottommost object, not the topmost. and I select this object. When I right-click on this object, I'm clicking on this object and I'm choosing conditional formatting, I'm expecting to get my conditional formatting. That is not the case. I'm getting nothing right here. And the way that this works is the top object wins. So all I have to do is simply say I am going to move this object to the top of all of these text fields. So I can select them. Let's use our selection marquee. I can see right there. I'm going to move this object on above or to the top of all of these objects. I'll move that one right there so that this should be the topmost object. I can see that it is when I select, and all the rest of these will be selected. I can make my selection right there and select all of them, and guess what happens now when I right click and choose conditional formatting? Lo and behold, what comes up is the conditional formatting from the topmost object. So what happens now as a result of having all 4 of these objects selected? Well, it gets applied to all of them instantly, and that is the time savings. One thing you need to be careful of is make sure that any one given object doesn't have its own unique conditional formatting, because that will wipe them out. So how does this work from layout to layout? It's easy. I just copy this layout. I go to my other layout, which looks very similar. I paste it temporarily. It becomes by default the topmost object. I select all of my other objects. I just bring up my conditional formatting, which I happen to have a shortcut key right there. I click OK, and instantly it's applied to all of my objects. A very big time savings, and not something that everybody knows. So I hope you like that one. That was tip number 7. All right, for tip number 6, we're talking about know your parts. Yes, the layout parts. There's a lot of little intricacies about layout parts. Let's take a look at some of the tips that deal with layout parts. First off, on the sidebar here, no matter what the orientation is, if you hold down the command key or the control key, it will flip these up and down, making them sometimes a little bit easier to drag. By default, FileMaker adds a header, a body, and a footer. In many cases, you don't need all of those parts for a particular layout. If it's just a form view, you may only need the body. So you would select the header and get rid of it, of course. But this is not the best default, in my opinion, and that is because if you are designing something that works on FileMaker Go or needs to be mobile ready in FileMaker, I don't know if it's 16 or 17 when they added it, but FileMaker added this top navigation and the bottom navigation parts. Otherwise, everything in the past historically has always been there, including the title header, leading grand, body, subsummary, footer, title footer. We'll talk about some of those. My opinion, everything, if it is at the top, should be top navigation, and here is why. The top navigation, and whatever color it is set to, so long that it's not a gradient, if it is a solid color, that is the color that is adopted on iOS using FileMaker Go as the color for the title bar. So if you just leave the header, then you do not get the opportunity to color the title bar. And in all honesty, the difference between these really only boils down to the fact that one can be zoomed and one cannot. The top navigation cannot be on mobile, that's FileMaker Go, pinch and zoomed. It is static at 100% locked, whereas the header can be. And it just gives you a different opportunity for using these for being able to color them. So there's really, when it comes to the difference on the title footer and the bottom navigation, there's really not a big impact there, but the top navigation definitely does apply to the color in terms of iOS, and a lot of users don't know that. So that's our first tip there in terms of layout parts. Another one is repositioning or adding new parts. There's 2 different ways to add a new part. We can go to our part tool right here as I hover, and we can drag this out. Now what happens is that part, according to the theme settings, and this is something that's underneath the hood, will be ignored. So in other words, if I drag out this right here, the only thing that FileMaker is going to be able to add is a top navigation or a title header. We can see right there. But that size is going to be determined based on where I drop. Let's go ahead and cancel that. If I want to add a fixed size, because sometimes what I have is I have objects in that space. Let's move these objects right here. And I'm saying to myself, I don't want to split these objects up, and I can drag this out, but that's not what I want. I want a top navigation part above that. What's a better way to do this than this drag and drop? Well, that is via a right click. When we right click, we get this option right here of part setup. Part setup is going to bring a little dialog up, and from here we can create new parts, and these parts get added into the layout at the size specified in the theme. So if I click create here and I choose a top navigation, that top navigation will be created and will be above the objects without having to drag this in right here. So sometimes you want the drag, sometimes you want to be able to just have the part added for you, and that's where using the part setup is really helpful. So now let's talk about dragging these particular parts. As you recall, this may be a little too thin. If I hold down Command and drag that, there are two things that I can do. I can drag this in order to make that part bigger. But let's say, for example, that this header area right here was a little bit bigger. And let's say that I wanted this top navigation to be around these objects. There's two ways I could do this. I could make this a little bit bigger, and then I could take the opportunity to select those and then move them up in. Or alternatively, I can simply ghost through those objects by resizing the part, ignoring what's on the layout. That again is done with a modifier key. I'm going to hold down the Option key, and as I drag, that part is going to ghost through those objects, being able to reposition the part, forgetting about what's on the layout. And then of course, finally with the part, if this isn't exactly what I want, all I have to do is select the part, go to my Position tab, and I can give it an exact value of what I want. If I want it to be 88 points high, there we go. It is now exactly the size that I want. Hold down a Command key, click that up, and those are the tips with regards to knowing your parts. There's all kinds of other little things that I could go on about, but I'll have to save that for my course, talking about when and how you can use these in all the different layouts, form versus list, etc. One little quick tip, the trailing grand summary is great for a very bottom part of your list views in order to show some buttons and some dialogues. Again, that will be in an upcoming series that I have about mastering FileMaker Layout design. So that was tip number 6, know your parts. And for tip number 5, select all tells all. And this is a great one. There are two reasons that knowing how to use select all, which seems super simple, will help you with regards to your layout. On this layout, I have some gremlins, some invisibles. In fact, it's super easy to accidentally create gremlins on your layout, but select all will show you that they are there. When I do a Command A, I can see through a visual scan on this layout that there is gremlin number 1 and here is gremlin number 2. The bounding box shows me that I have these gremlins outside, but even if they were inside right here, and I did a select all, I can still clearly see that this is something that I may not want, and this happens quite often. We've got a little character right there, which is just a space character. How did that get created? Well, sometimes you're sitting here, maybe you get a phone call, and you've got the layout selected, but you just hit the space bar. And the space bar, FileMaker conveniently adds this little gremlin for you. And then you get off your phone call and you click and you're moving on. You click another object and you don't know that you created that unless you do the select all, do a quick visual scan of the layout, find those gremlins, and then you delete them. Of course, you can always come over here and we can simply just hit the space bar and filter down to all of our text. And there are 3 gremlins, and we can go 1, 2, and 3 and get rid of them all at once. Another big benefit of the select all comes in the form of your themes. So right now, when I select all, I can see on this layout that I do not have any modified objects with regards to styles. I can see that because this right here tells me that I have multiple objects type, and this is not red. Let's see what happens when we make a selection. Let's change this field. I'll change the field ever so slightly. Let's just take off one border, and maybe we don't necessarily know that that's what's going on. Now, this really only applies if you are intent on keeping a clean theme, which is something that I highly suggest and will be a topic in an upcoming course that I have about being a design master in FileMaker, but if I do a select all, lo and behold, I get the red triangle of death. That's our bloody triangle. We do not want red triangles. The star and the triangle means that on this layout, I have modified objects. Of course, going through those objects, simply a matter of selecting your first object and then hitting the tab key and cycling through all objects until we see that little character. You can see right here I'm doing it really quick and letting it cycle through all the objects. And we get to the object that right there. I do a reverse tab with Shift Tab, and there we go. There is my modified object that I was told about by using Select All, which was tip number 5. For tip number 4, I'm going to tell you that it's all about position, position, position. So just like real estate, if it's location, 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 or a business, we are completely interested in our position tab. What is our task? We want to get this field exactly 10 pixels, or let's say 12 pixels away from this particular field. We can do that in 2 ways. We know that the Shift arrow key moves this by 10 points. That's what we have access to in FileMaker. It's either the regular arrow for 1 point, or in the newer versions of FileMaker, the Shift key will move it by 10 points. So in this case, I picked 10 points as an example, but we can always use our math. This position tab tells us everything that we need to know, and our basic math will always help us out. If I want to get this object next to this object, all I have to do is look at its right edge. In fact, all I have to do is copy its right edge. By copying that, selecting this object, and then selecting its left edge, and just hitting paste. That has now put that object directly on that edge. If I want it 10 pixels away, I just simply hit that, and I'm now 10 pixels away. Of course, I could have, with that object originally in its position, selected this object, grab the right, and rather than actually doing the moving with the cursor, I just increase it by 10. In this case, I go from 573 on the left to 583. I've already added the 10 for me, and that's the wrong object right there. I don't want that to happen. I accidentally didn't need to move that. So I select the first object, get the right from it, select the next object, and then go into my left and do my math. Now, I can do the math in my head, 83, but there are so many other graphics programs. If there is a FileMaker engineer that watches this video, please, for the love of everything that is cool, give us the ability to just do simple math within this dialog box. This does not work in FileMaker, but I pray it would. You would be able to just add a plus sign and go plus 10, and then it would automatically do the math and put the result in for you. Photoshop does this. Sketch does this. So many applications do that. FileMaker doesn't. So we have to do it in our heads. But no big deal. In this case, it's 10 pixels. If it was 12, it was some other number, I'm sure I'd be able to come up with it. And I get my objects exactly where I want in the position where the position should be, because it's position, position, position for tip number 4. For tip number 3, have you sampled my data? Yep, sample data is extremely useful when you are trying to lay out your objects according to the data. Now, we don't want to do what's called data fitting, where we design specifically just to one specific set of data, not thinking about all the other possible forms of data that may come into a field, but this is where sample data is really helpful. Under the View menu, we have a Show option, and this one right here of Sample Data is extremely useful. It allows you to see not only what fields are, but also what your data will look like, and that data is dependent on the record that you leave when you move from Browse mode into layout mode. Let's take a look. So in my file right now, I happen to have no records in the file. When I show the sample data, which I have signed a shortcut key to, I suggest you do it too. Go ahead and look back at one of the previous tips. I forget which one it was, where I talked about the align and arrange. But if I turn on that sample data, FileMaker is going to use data respective of the fields that it is. So we can see quite clearly that this is a date field, this is a timestamp field, and this is just a text field. And when I toggle back, I can see that that's what I have named the fields. Super obvious. But maybe your field, your date field isn't named date. And maybe you have a field label above this that says that it is a date, but it turns out that this is going to be a regular text field. The key here is, in order to see FileMaker's sample data, you have to be on an empty record. If we go into browse mode and we now create a new record and we put in some sample data like a last name and then a date right here. Let's go ahead and put in a date, and then here we'll put a timestamp right there. And let's say this is all the same field. Super long data right there. So we are going to be able to see, because we are on this record, I'll create another new record right there. There's an empty record. So I'm on an empty record right now, and I go into layout mode, and my sample data is showing what FileMaker thinks is good sample data. However, if I go back into browse mode, go to my record, and now I go into layout mode with sample data on, we can see that it is showing the sample data from that record. So you simply go to the record that has the longest string of text, and then you can size your fields accordingly so that that data will show. Of course, it's always a good idea to give yourself a little bit of extra breathing room if more data could come in after the fact, and it could be even longer. Just make sure that you give room where that data can show if it is going to wrap. Otherwise, what we have is the ability to use sample data in order to adjust our layout accordingly, and that's going to be tip number 3, sample data. For tip number 2, I'm going to suggest that you remember opacity. Now, a lot of us, we deal with colors, and those colors are really easy to set if we just set the straight color. Right here I have a header area, and in this header area I have a primary header, and then I have a subheader. Now I've done this with 3 different objects. I have my text, I have my background color, and then I have this object right here. Now, instead of using 4 objects, I did not put text on top of a rectangle object. I simply just chose to make the text box itself the color that I want. But here is the problem. If I want to make a change, then I'm going to have to make 2 changes instead of just 1. As we switch this header by selecting our graphics here and then choosing our color, and I want to use blue now. I see the problem that I have created here. I took the opportunity and made this match my primary color. It is much easier to use opacity in order to control this, because I can set this to either a black or a white and then use that opacity in order to achieve the exact same effect. So we'll go back to the green, and how do we do that? Well, we select our object right here, and instead of choosing the darker shade of green that we are on, we choose the black. And then we select again after we've chosen the black, and we choose the option to choose other color right here. As soon as we do, then we get the palette that comes up, and that palette has this value right here, our opacity. So I can now adjust this to whatever I want. I can pretty much match that green that it was before right there. So let's say it's at 30%. And we say OK, and now with a single switch, I am able to have color variation. This applies to blacks and whites. Just remember, if there is a color variation and you have a color underneath, can you remember opacity and use that, because it affords me the opportunity to simply just select this one color, and I get the benefit of both by simply remembering opacity. So that is tip number 2. And for our final tip, tip number 1, I'm going to suggest that you always remember to use bulk operations. In FileMaker, if you're doing one thing to one thing and you need it done to a lot of things, do that one thing to a lot of things, not one thing to one thing. This is very similar to, I believe it was tip number 7, where we had our top object wins with conditional formatting, where we are applying it to multiple objects. The same thing applies here when we are going to affect any of the objects on the layout. If it is turning off spell checking for these 3 fields, I'm not going to select this field, then go over to the inspector, and then move down to the do not apply visual spell checking, and check that one, and then select this one, and then select this one. No, I am going to turn it off for all 3 by selecting all of them, and then doing all of that all at one time. If all of these need to get a new font, hopefully you're using styles. This is a bad example, but if I was using custom overrides, we can select and we can change all of them at one time. And in fact, what will happen is if these are differing in terms of their sizes, which I'm going to increase the size right here, that is now 13 point. We can see that right there. But I'm going to yet still select all of these and do a bulk operation. We see that FileMaker, when it cannot render the actual value that it is, it will show this little dash. But even still, I can come into this box and change it and set all of them at one time to 16. Now again, this particular example is bad because preferably you will have used a style and applied that style to all of these fields, restyle one of them, and then simply go save the style, and it impacts all that are using that same style. So bad example here for styling, but great for bulk operations. Likewise, if we are going to select all of these, if we're playing with anything here, if we're dealing with our anchors, if we are dealing with sliding invisibility, anything in our data tab with regards to setting field entry and turning off browse mode, turning off find, selecting all contents, bulk operations, we're not going to do all of them. In fact, if you want select entire contents on entry, you can do the select same or use our object palette, which we learned about earlier, and select all fields and turn them all on at one time. That is our bulk operations. All of my fields where I want to use the return key, I'm going to turn those on right here, affecting all of them at once. And my suggestion is that you can save these things to do them at the end if you need to. If at the end I have a checklist and that checklist includes set the tab order, make all fields use the return and enter key, turn off visual spell checking on name fields, etc. That checklist is something that allows you to use the selections that we learned about earlier on in this video. Select all your objects and apply those bulk operations. So I hope all of these sets of tips have helped you become more efficient, or will help you become more efficient while working in FileMaker's layout mode. There are so many more aspects to making your solutions look like professional software. If you are interested in more videos like this video, you always feel free to check out FileMakerMagazine.com, and there you will find additional videos and also some links to some courses if you'd like to learn more about developing in FileMaker Pro. So, this is Matt Petrowsky signing out. As always, much luck to you and happy FileMaking. We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.FileMakerMagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.